Chairman, thank you very much. Before I get into the thrust of my remarks, let me put your discussion of the financial situation of the government in a broader context. Obviously, that is a hugely important issue, but it has to be put into the context about what's happening in our economy in general. And what's happening in our economy in general is that for the last 30 years, there has been a massive transfer of wealth from the middle class and working families of this country. We are talking about many, many trillions of dollars to the top 1/10 of 1%. So when we talk about budget priorities and budget process, we have to look at the broader picture of what is happening in America. Can't forget that. So we are living in a situation now where, unbelievably, the top 1/10 of 1% now owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. We're looking at a situation where one family, wealthiest family in America, owns more wealth than the bottom 40%. We're looking at a situation today where people in the state of Vermont, and I suspect in Wyoming, are working longer hours for lower wages. Millions of people working 2 or 3 jobs, and yet 58% of all new income is going to the top 1%. So to begin this discussion about budget without looking at the reality of what's happening in America, which is that for 40 years, the middle class of this country has been disappearing, looking at a country today which has 47 million people living in poverty, looking at a nation which has highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major country on earth, looking at a country which has more income and wealth inequality than any other major country, and worse here today than any time since 1928. If we don't take those factors into consideration, we're missing, I believe, the most important point. And that takes us to where we are right now. Just a couple of weeks ago, we started a new fiscal year without eliminating sequestration. I think that was a serious mistake. These arbitrary, across-the-board budget cuts are damaging the economy and are hurting millions of the most vulnerable people in our country, especially the children, the very old, the sick, and the poor. Are those the people we really want to go after at a time when we have massive income and wealth inequality? Adding insult to injury, we are also less than 2 weeks away from hitting the debt ceiling. If we do not act by November 3rd, we will default on our bills for the first time in our nation's history. Mr. Chairman, you talked about people's faith in government diminishing. Well, let me tell you something. If the United States government, under Republican leadership in the House and the Senate, does not pay its bills, you ain't seen nothing in terms of people's faith in government diminishing. Mr. Chairman, let us be clear. Defaulting on our debt would be a disaster. I hope and expect there is not a lot of disagreement on that. It would precipitate a national and international financial crisis. If a default occurs, interest rates will spike for home mortgages, car loans, student loans, and credit cards. Millions of Americans can lose their life savings and pensions. Millions of veterans, senior citizens, our brave men and women in our armed forces, young children who depend on food stamps, and our entire economy would be put at risk. I hope my Republican colleagues will not allow that to happen and will do what we have done throughout the history of this country, pay our bills. Mr. President, Mr. Chairman, it would be wrong for my Republican colleagues to attempt to shut down the government or threaten the full faith and credit of the United States government, as they have done in the past, because of their dislike of Obamacare or Planned Parenthood, or because of their desire to cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. You have your opinions. That's fine. But you talked about regular order. Fine, let's debate those issues. We have a budget process. Don't shut down the government because people disagree with what Planned Parenthood does. I think they do a great job. You may not. Don't shut down the government because of that issue. I hope everybody in this room would agree that that is wrong. A democratic government cannot function when a small faction chooses to hold the American people hostage in hopes of cutting programs that, in fact, the vast majority of the people in this country actually support. I understand that my Republican colleagues are concerned about the deficit, which, by the way, and I think it's important to throw this on the table, is the deficit today a serious issue? Yes, it is. But let us not forget that that deficit has been reduced by more than 2/3 in the last 6 years, not in inconsequential effort. And when we talk about the deficit, and when we talk about an $18.4 trillion national debt, let us not forget. But apparently it's a lesson that some of my Republican colleagues have forgotten, is that a lot of this deficit and debt has a lot to do with wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which we haven't paid for. And I do find it always remarkable that many of my Republican colleagues feel we have to cut Medicare and Medicaid and nutrition programs for hungry children, just have to pay for those things. But apparently when you go to wars, hey, you can put that on the credit card. The national debt is an issue that all of us are concerned about. But where we disagree is how you address the deficit and the debt. And we feel strongly that from a moral perspective and from an economic perspective, you do not balance the budget on the backs of the elderly, the children, the sick, and the poor. When you have massive income and wealth inequality, you do not balance the budget on the backs of the most vulnerable people in this country. Today, as I think most people know, major corporation after major corporation pays in a given year nothing in federal income taxes. Profitable corporations like GE, Verizon, and Boeing have not only paid nothing in federal income taxes in a given year, they actually got rebates from the IRS. So maybe we want to take a look at that issue before we cut the WIC program, which provides assistance to low-income pregnant women and their babies. According to a report from the Congressional Research Service, each and every year, profitable corporations are avoiding about $100 billion in taxes by stashing their profits in the Cayman Islands and other offshore tax havens. In 1952, corporations contributed about 32% of all federal revenue. Today, they contribute about 11%, one-third of what they did in 1952. In terms of individual tax rates, we have a situation where hedge fund managers on Wall Street, who make hundreds of millions of dollars a year, pay an effective tax rate lower than a truck driver or a nurse. Yet my Republican colleagues have been absolutely determined to make certain that the wealthy and large corporations not contribute one penny more for deficit reduction, and that all of the sacrifice comes from the middle class and working families in terms of cuts to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, LIHEAP, community health centers, education, Head Start, nutrition, affordable housing, et cetera, et cetera. Mr. Chairman, here are just a few examples of what will happen if we do not eliminate sequestration this year. At a time when real unemployment is over 10%, 800,000 fewer jobs will be created. 2 million young Americans, dislocated workers, and veterans will not get the job training they need. 620 community health centers will not open their doors, which would reduce access to primary care for more than 2.6 million Americans. 144,000 young children will not be able to enroll in Head Start. 430,000 Americans will not get the comprehensive family planning and preventative health services they need, and 20,000 veterans will not get the medical care they need through the VA. Mr. Chairman, I would hope that all of us would agree that this is unacceptable. At a time of massive wealth and income inequality, let us work together on a budget that is fair, that does not go after the most vulnerable in our country. At the very least, I hope we can all agree right now that the United States government should pay its bills on time, and we will not allow the U.S. to become a deadbeat nation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.